Today, Chef Brian is thinking about cooking up some 30-06. So I pulled out my recipe book, the manual, and looking around the shop, some stuff I've got on hand that's been here probably way too long. I've got some brand new brass. I've got a box of Hornaday Amax 168 grain molly coated, and I've also got some Accurate Arms 4064, which works great in bolt action rifles for a 30-06. Not so great if you're loading for a bar or an M1 Garand, but in the bolt gun it works just fine. Now what I have here, I've got laid out, I've got a couple of hand priming tools. I want to talk about a couple of things when you're using particularly one of these one at a time hand priming deals. But the brass, I pulled 50 casings out of a 100 count box, and I did sort of a general inspection here. And the mouths are really pretty good. They're not all dinged up and beat up. I grabbed a case gauge here. I happen to have a 30-06 case gauge, and I checked not all of them, but I grabbed a handful of casings and drop them right in. They go in and out just fine. If I didn't happen to have a case gauge, I can always grab the rifle itself and make sure that I can close the bolt without having any issues. But let's just say that either the mouths were all dinged up and or I had some problems dropping them into the case gauge, or I'm having a hard time closing the bolt. That has happened on occasion. So don't just take it for granted that a brand new batch of brass is going to be problem free and you could load it up. You may have a really unpleasant surprise. Always check. Trust but verify, right? So if the casings, won't drop into the case gauge, you're going to need to run them through a full length sizing die. And, you got an expander ball there that's going to true up the necks at the same time. But let's just say that the bodies were all fine, but some of those necks were a little bit dinged up. So now I can run them over a mandrel, or I can just run them over the expander, not run them all the way up into a full length die, or I can run them up into a neck die. But whatever it is you're going to do with a batch of brass, if you've just got some casings where the necks are dinged up, don't just do that handful and then not do the rest, because what you're doing is you're changing those casings. And the same thing with your brass. If the body, there's some issues with some, but not necessarily with all of it, you should do the exact same thing with the entire batch. Accuracy is about consistency. You make one and you absolutely clone it to the greatest degree you possibly can, and accuracy goes a long way along that line. So if you do one, do them all, or you just set that one aside and do a fouling shot, or you get the idea. So here I've got two tools. This is a much older handheld priming tool from Lee, and this one is a much newer tool and quite ergonomic design by K&M. Now both of these are going to use shell holders. The older style Lee is the one that's got a thread that threads into the top of the tool, and the one from K&M uses the modern Lee style handheld priming tool shell holders. When you're looking for the correct shell holder for any of these, and let's say like this one, I got this stuff it's in a Tupperware box on a used lot of stuff. Priming tools in there, and 10 or so shell holders, and I don't have the chart. So I need to find the correct shell holder. So I grab the casing and I start going through these things, and I'm feeling for the fit. So I start trying a few. Yeah, that one's really loose. That's no good. And you're going to notice, well, that doesn't even go in. That's no good. This one, same thing. So you find a couple that, okay, well, it goes all the way in. Now I need to refine that a little bit further, because if you don't have the correct shell holder, or one that's at least pretty close, you're going to have problems with your primer seating. So for example, I've got a case holder here that it's looking pretty good. It's going in. The diameter is certainly correct, but do this, go to lift it. You see, some shell holders are designed for specific cartridges that maybe have a bit thicker rim, and the cut that's here in the shell holder is going to be taller to accommodate a wider rim. So maybe the diameter works for you, but you put it in here and this thing is lifting. So what's going to happen is, if you use that, the primer plunger when it goes to push the primer into the pocket, is going to lift the casing. So the casing is going to be taller than the height of the plunger is going to be able to reach to get it to the below flush position. And it's got to be at least 1/1000th below flush. It has to be below flush. Now, the other thing for that is if you have, when you put this in here, it looks like it's going in pretty much. I can't really lift it. It's a good solid fit. But you know what? This one doesn't look like it's going quite all the way to the back. But it fits and it's not moving around. So this would be good, right? Well, here's how you tell. Put the case in here and turn it over and look through the hole that the plunger comes up through to seat the primer, and make sure that the flash hole of the casing is centered in the center of the hole that the plunger is going into. If it is not, if it is off center, right? If it's off center, you're going to try and push a primer into a hole that's not quite lined up with that, and you're going to start crushing primers. You're going to have all sorts of trouble. Now, if it's pretty close, what you can do is you take your deburring tool and you cut a little chamfer on your casing. Now, you don't want to get rambunctious and go too deep, but if you can get it just enough for that primer to slide past that and go into the pocket, and then once you do that, you press the plunger, it pushes the primer in, you turn the case 180 degrees, it can be seated pretty flush, and then we're going to check that to make sure it is in fact below flush. Show you a couple of ways to do that. So the first handheld priming tool I'm going to use here is the Lee, and I'm going to grab a primer, and you're doing this the slow manual method, and you just drop that into the recess that's here in the top of the tool in the shell holder, and you grab a casing and you're going to put this in here, and we're doing this one at a time. Now, I have had more than one person over the years tell me, well, you really shouldn't be handling these things because, you know, primers can be denigrated by oil, and if you've got really oily skin, that could wreck the primer. Now, I'm not saying that has never happened. I have never personally shook hands with anybody whose hands were so oily it was dripping off of there where it's going to destroy a primer. I've done this literally tens of thousands of times over the years, and I personally have never had an issue. That doesn't mean you can't. If you got oil dripping off of your hands, don't handle any gun that belongs to me. You probably got a lot of acidity to your skin too, and you're going to like leave rust all over my gun the second you set it down. I digress. So we're going to give this a good squeeze. Now that went in so smooth and easily. That's what's nice about these Lee tools. It's worn in, but it's not worn out. I'm going to give this 180 degree turn, and I'm going to do it again. Now, this wood slab that I have here that has since turned to rock is really pretty flat. So I set this on here, and it's not, you know, doing this business. So I know that that primer is seated below flush. Now I'm going to check that with the depth gauge on my caliper in just a moment, so I know exactly how much below flush it happens to be. But I know right from the get-go here I'm off to a good start. Now I'm going to use the K&M. Now the K&M is a bit more of an ergonomic design. And then the plunger here on the top, it has this sleeve. So when I drop a primer into here, if I tip this thing a bit, you know, one way or another, it's not going to fall off. Now the Lee, it sits in a little bit of a recess, but this also has an additional sleeve to keep you from dropping it on the floor if you know, have a little moment lapse of concentration and then you tip the thing downwards. So here now, I put the case in here and I give this a squeeze. Now this thing is pretty stout. It's a brand, well, it's not brand new. It's a newer tool, and it's got a pretty stout spring in there. So I give that another 180 degree turn. And I'm going to use the thumb from my left hand to assist that and make sure as I give a visual here, yeah, that's seated well below flush. So I set that down. It's not wiggling around anywhere, so I know it is in fact below flush. So let's find out how much. Now you should know how to use the depth gauge on your calipers. You can drop it like that and you just simply lower the caliper down on top of it and you give that a look. I didn't do that very well. I can do that again. Now this method for me has always been a little bit trickier, and I'm at 1.5 thousandths. Now, otherwise, you put your thumb on a little roller here and you make sure that the bottom of the caliper is flat on the head of the casing, and now just apply downward pressure on your roller and you look, and again, 1.5. We're golden. K&M. Again, same sort of thing. You figure out which method works best for you. Do it like that. 1.5. Same thing, 1.5. So I'm golden. It has to be below flush. Now, one of the things that I use is just sort of a mental note to me to keep in mind for like inspect stuff. My primers, I'm looking to get them 3 thousandths below flush. They have to be below flush. I'm aiming for 3. If it's less, fine. It is below flush. If I wanted to get that deeper, companies like Frankfurt Arsenal, they have a dial on their handheld priming unit. And if I want to get it deeper, I turn the dial and the plunger will go higher to push the primer deeper. If it's going too deep, I can go the other way and the plunger will not go quite as high. So there's some adjustability to that. But these things, as they're manufactured, generally will put the primer right where you want it. But primers below flush, I'm shooting for 3. Same thing I use when I'm trimming casings. If my casings are all within 3 thousandths of each other, great. Concentricity, I have to have that projectile have less than 3 thousandths in run out, preferably 0, but you get the idea. I just use 3 thousandths as an easy thing to remember, and it works very well for me. So if you're having trouble and the primers aren't getting below flush, make sure that you got the correct shell holder and the thing isn't lifting. That occurs more often than you might think. And if you have any other issues with that, first take a look at the shell holder and make sure that maybe you've not military brass that's got a crimp in there that you need to either swage or cut out of there with a military crimp remover. Otherwise, priming casings, you should feel a little bit of a resistance with it going in. It should not be hard, and you should not hear anything ever go bang. And by the way, I didn't mention this, but I'm going to say it right now anyway. I don't point this at my face when I'm doing this. It's either pointing up or it's pointing away. That's sort of a common sense thing, but sometimes I think about, you got to mention things for the safety stuff. That this is hilarious. My wife sells like craft stuff on eBay. She's got this rice paper that she sells with this crafting kit thing. The manufacturer of the rice paper tells my wife, in the description when you're listing our product on eBay, put in there a disclaimer that this is rice paper. You're not supposed to eat it. I don't know the people that are doing crafting are that stupid, but apparently the people who manufacture this stuff and tell her to write these disclaimers do not think too highly of their customers. I think much more highly of you, by the way. Happy trails.